DE Cordial, my name is James Nagle, welcome to The Irish Nation Lives. Shortly after 6 o'clock on the evening of the 23rd of June 1919, a car bearing Eamon de Valera pulled up in front of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Several hundred people had gathered to see the man described as the President of the elected government of the Irish nation, and wild cheering broke out as he made for the entrance. De Valera had been smuggled on board a ship for the United States earlier in the month and had arrived in New York City on the 11th of June. He had gone undercover, meeting with his mother for the first time in 12 years before planning for his great unveiling. Harry Boland had been sent on to the US earlier to prepare for De Valera's arrival. On his first night back in his native city, Boland took De Valera to the apartment of Liam Mellows, a Galway volunteer commander who had escaped to America after the 1916 Rising. Here De Valera was introduced to Joseph McGarrity, a Tyrone native who had made his fortune in the liquor industry and used his wealth to finance the Howth gunrunning. McGarrity acted as a type of spin doctor. He understood what would appeal to an American audience, and it was he who suggested that De Valera should be addressed as President of the Irish Republic, arguing that it sounded better and would be easier for the media to understand than his actual title, President of Dáil Éireann. This would cause confusion in the future, especially during the treaty debates. On the 17th of June, a letter was read in Dáil Éireann in which De Valera appointed Arthur Griffith as Deputy President in my absence. This drove stories in the newspapers that he had indeed travelled to the United States, or maybe Paris or Switzerland, and New York was abuzz with rumours and sightings of him in the days ahead. Having manoeuvred through the crowds gathered outside and in the lobby, De Valera made his way to the roof of the Waldorf Astoria for his first official meeting in the United States. Here he was introduced to John Devoy, the power behind Clann na Gael, an Irish-American organisation with close links to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. No man had given more service to the cause than Devoy. He was arrested and imprisoned after the failed 1866 rebellion and had lived in the United States since he was exiled in 1871. In recent years, he had been involved in planning the 1916 Rising and had opened up communications between Roger Casement and the German embassy in the United States. When Casement travelled to Germany to negotiate with the government directly, his trip was funded by Clann na Gael. De Valera also met for the first time with Judge Daniel Cohallen, a member of the New York Supreme Court, an influential member of the Democratic Party and one of the founding members of the Friends of Irish Freedom. These two men in particular held considerable power in the Irish-American community and should have been De Valera's closest allies. Instead, the relationship between these men will break down in acrimony, and by the time De Valera leaves the United States, he will have rent asunder the Friends of Irish Freedom and established a rival organisation. Many lay the blame for this firmly at the feet of Eamon de Valera, and see in it a foreshadowing of the split on the treaty. Supporters of Devoy and Cohallen will describe De Valera as acting like an entitled, spoiled child, driven mad by a lust for power and his need to control. However, the divisions that lead to this split had already begun to appear before De Valera had arrived in the United States. In February, the Friends of Irish Freedom had held an Irish race convention in Philadelphia and established the Irish Victory Fund under the direction of Diarmuid Lynch. In May, McGarrity clashed with Cohallen and Devoy over how much of the money raised should be sent to Ireland. While he favoured sending as much as possible to Dáil Éireann to use as they saw fit, Cohallen especially believed that the money would best serve Ireland by strengthening Irish-American groups and securing the election of sympathetic candidates to political office. While Cohallen and Devoy saw De Valera and his supporters as blow-ins who didn't understand the complex American political landscape, throwing their weight around and making demands that couldn't be met, De Valera saw men who had never set foot in Ireland, convinced that they knew best what the Irish people needed, and who believed that this could be best achieved by wasting money on US presidential elections. While all seemed calm initially, the battle lines were already being drawn, Diarmuid Lynch rowing in behind Cohallen and Devoy, while De Valera was backed by McGarrity, Boland and Mellows, as well as Dr. Patrick McCartan, the unofficial Irish ambassador to the United States, and the shadowy Dr. William J. Maloney, who Devoy was convinced was a British spy. On Sunday the 29th of June, De Valera delivered the first of many speeches at a rally at Fenway Park, the home of the Boston Red Sox baseball team. It is estimated that up to 50,000 people crammed the stadium for the event, and thousands more had met his train at every stop en route. On stage, he sat beside a soldier carrying a tattered American flag flown by troops when they had fought in France the previous year, and present also was a who's who of New York's political, legal, and religious elite. Senator David Walsh, a son of Irish immigrants, compared De Valera to US President Lincoln, and the meeting was reported the following day in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. In the months ahead, there would be many such meetings. In July, in Madison Square Gardens, Father Francis Duffy, the most decorated cleric in US Army history for his actions during the First World War, introduced De Valera to a capacity audience of 12,000, with half that number again locked outside, and later that month at Wrigley Field in Chicago, a crowd of 25,000 gave him a half-hour-long standing ovation. His first major tour of the United States carried him as far as San Francisco. In 23 days, he travelled over 6,000 miles and delivered 17 major speeches to close to 500,000 people. Through it all, he continuously returned to a number of key points. He would compare the Irish struggle for freedom to that waged by the United States almost 150 years beforehand, and would remind his audience that President Woodrow Wilson had entered the First World War promising self-determination for small nations. His hope of gaining admittance to the Paris Peace Conference came to nothing when the Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June. Recognition of the Irish Republic by the United States became his next goal, but just as important was raising the Dáil loan. De Valera had been authorised by Dáil Éireann to raise over $1 million, but the reception in America led him to ask for authority to increase this to $5 million. However, at his first press conference the day after his arrival, the legality of the loan was challenged, as it was illegal to raise money for political purposes in a foreign country, and as the Irish Republic wasn't recognised by the United States, any bonds sold would contravene stringent anti-fraud laws. Joseph McGarrity and a New York lawyer, Martin Conboy, were able to get around this issue by a feat of legal linguistics, whereby they would sell bond certificates instead of bonds. A young up-and-coming New York lawyer by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt met with De Valera and signed off on the legality of this formula, allowing them to proceed. Promoting the bond drive would cause just as much trouble though, with De Valera and Cohalan arguing for over 4 hours on one occasion over the choice of a handful of words on an advertisement. However, it would be many months before the bond drive would actually get off the ground. In August, De Valera asked that the Friends of Irish Freedom shut down the Irish Victory Fund by the end of the month, so as not to take from the Dáil loan. Considering that his stay in one of the most lavish hotels in the world was being financed from this fund, and that they had forwarded $100,000 to set up the bond drive, you can imagine that this only furthered the animosity between the two groups. McGarrity procured offices in New York to deal with the work of floating the bond, and the Irish Victory Fund closed on the 31st of August, though it would long have to support De Valera and his entourage, as the bond drive wouldn't start until January of 1920. The petty squabbling and cushy lifestyle of the Irish delegation will stand out in stark contrast to events in Ireland when, in September, Dáil Éireann is suppressed by the British authorities. This doesn't lead to an end to the fighting, and instead sees more childish behaviour, which I will cover in the next episode on De Valera's stay in America. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to subscribe. I'll be covering the major events, people and organisations of the Irish Revolution in the months ahead, and over on Twitter I'm putting up summaries of Irish affairs in Westminster 100 years ago. On the 24th of June 1919, the day after De Valera made his first public appearance in the United States, a letter was read out in Parliament confirming that 2 members of the House of Commons, J.J. Clancy and Countess Markievicz, had been sentenced to 3 and 4 months in prison respectively. Check out the social media links in the description. Accorda, thank you for joining me on The Irish Nation Lives. Slán go fóill.